Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 3:15, and so we're going to get started here. Thank you for coming to this session. So this session, I am going to be the moderator. My name is Leanne Dillard. I am the 4-H Extension Specialist for the state of Alabama, which is a little bit south of here. But this session is going to focus on the use of integrated crop livestock systems in the eastern U.S. So we're going to have several speakers today that are going to cover a variety of topics, but from throughout the eastern part of the U.S. So we're going to get started with Dr. Mary Dronowski, who's from the University of Nebraska.
I can try that one. I can't stand in front of anything anyways. So I love my state because depending on who I talk to, I'm in the east or I'm in the west. So I get to be either one. But the other thing you probably need to know about me is today you get the animal scientist perspectives on soils. So if you were looking for a soils expert, I play one on TV. No? Okay. The question that I'm trying to answer today is, can you have your cake and eat it too? So, right, can we improve soil health and use cover crops as a forage resource? And if you can't imagine, as an animal scientist and ruminant nutritionist, I have a bit of a bias here because I see all green plants as a forage source. So my approach today really was to take a combination of, let's see what data is out there in temperate climates, and combine that with observations from some of our research. So you're going to get a little bit of both today, hopefully to avoid bias, although there's always bias in every presentation, in my opinion. So take it as you will. I did want to show you this real quick, though. As a ruminant nutritionist, one of the cool things is that I learned very quickly when I started in integrated crop livestock systems that the soil is very much like the rumen, right? Everything is all about carbon and nitrogen. But I had this view in my head about what's going on above ground tells me a lot about what's going on below ground. And this was kind of one of those paradigm shifting moments for me. Was I went out to a field that was rye planted after soybeans, and in early March, it was only 3 inches tall, so it didn't look like much was going on. And we decided, let's just probe it and see what it looks like. And when we found a live root down to 30 inches, I was kind of in awe, right? So it was one of those moments that made me realize maybe everything I see doesn't tell me everything about what's going on. So as we talk about this idea of the soil and cover crops, I'm really going to be focused on what the literature that compares a true cover crop to a cover crop that was grazed. Okay, so not looking at a system where they've integrated cover crops and grazing together without a control of the cover crop alone, because the question is, what does grazing do? So that's the question I'm trying to answer today. So the first question that I was looking at was compaction, because that's the number one question I get. In fact, when I started my job in Nebraska, that was the number one reason why people didn't want cattle on cropland. They were worried about compaction. So I went into the literature, and from a cover crop perspective, I could find between 10 and 11 papers, one of those looking at bulk density, so porosity of the soil. And you can see we get a 50-50 split pretty much, that about 50% of the time they were seeing an increase in bulk density or penetration resistance, or they saw no effect. And what does that mean? Well, like all good extension answers, it depends, right? So what does it depend on? Well, there's a couple of things that come out. Probably the number one, right, is soil conditions. If it was wet when they were grazing, there's increased risk of increased penetration resistance and bulk density. I think everybody probably knows that. But there's a couple other things that was really interesting. One was that conventional tilled soils were the ones where they were more likely to see an increase in penetration resistance or bulk density, and that makes sense too because it has less soil structure. So no-till, of course, is beneficial from that standpoint, and especially long-term no-till. So a lot of the ones where they didn't see any impact were long-term no-till systems. The other thing that was really useful to understand is that even when we did get increase in penetration resistance or bulk density, it seemed to be short-lived. that a lot of times they can measure it 1 year, and even if they come back the next year and they graze, they still couldn't pick it up anymore. It seems like you can have an impact. It's very shallow. It gets ameliorated very quickly due to freeze-thaw or wet-dry cycles, microbial activity, those types of things, which is kind of neat. I have a picture here where we actually were grazing on corn residue. It's very hard to see, but basically we tilled the soil with the cattle. We were looking at the worst case scenario. We grazed in the spring. We triple stocked. We were trying to cause compaction. And indeed, we did increase bulk density and penetration resistance, but not above the threshold to impact root growth. Just like all of these studies, they didn't see that either, to be frank. And we actually got an increase in soybean yield, which is kind of interesting, but that's a carbon nitrogen thing, I believe. Okay, so the one thing that I did see that does give me a little bit of pause and where we saw kind of more consistent negative effects is water infiltration. You see in the literature 50-50 again. A couple things that we did notice is that, again, variation within the same study. They might see an increase in 1 year, or a decrease in water infiltration, but then the next year they wouldn't pick it up. And there was a tendency we would look at stocking densities, and if they had higher stocking density, they were more likely to see a decrease in infiltration rate. And I would say our observations are the same. So this was a study that we did grazing cereal rye after corn silage. And you can see we had 2 years of data, and I just really wanted to point out let's see if I can make this work. This is what it looked like after they were grazed. So, they were not grazing very heavy. And this was actually what the ungrazed part of the field looked like. And the key thing that I really want to point out, there's a lot of variability, but the cover crop improved water infiltration, but then if we grazed it, we basically negated that benefit. And that's when they were not grazing super heavy. In a different study where we grazed to where it looks a little less beneficial here in that we were grazing it very hard, grazing it down to less than 2 inches in some cases. This happened to be a weekend where they didn't get moved when they were supposed to. But we can see that in this case, the cover crop really didn't have a huge benefit on water infiltration, but definitely grazing it brought that down to where we were seeing some negative effects on water infiltration rate. Bottom line there, we also saw that in our fall grazing studies. So this was oats planted after corn silage, and this is kind of what it looked like about the time we were going to pull off. And if we looked at in the spring water infiltration, we didn't see any significant effects of the cover crop or grazing the cover crop, but you can kind of see the same general trend that maybe the cover crop is going up and grazing it kind of brought that back down. So that's probably the most consistent thing I've seen that's probably negative. I'm kind of telling you most of my story here that there's not a lot else that was going on, in my opinion, that was negative. If we look at soil organic matter, in some cases they were seeing some negative impacts at 30%. The rest of the time, no effect. Should point out, most of the studies are less than 5 years. Soil organic matter changes take a long time, right? Unfortunately, we need long-term studies, right? But I will say that one of the trends that I noticed was that if they were grazing the cover crop while it was growing, that was the only ones that were tending to see this negative effect on the soil organic matter, and it was only when they had really high intensities. And there's actually a really cool study out of Brazil where they were doing oats after soybeans, and they have a long growing season in the winter, right, for the oats to be grazed. And in that case, they had a low, a medium, and a high stocking density. And on the high, they were keeping it down to 10 centimeters. That's where they saw that negative impact on soil organic matter. So I really think this is something that we need to understand. Like, what is the threshold at which we're going to start seeing negative effects? What's the threshold at which, as long as we're above that, we're going to have our cake and eat it too, so to speak? And I think for all of these things, that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. In our studies, we really don't see much. This is that Tecumseh site is the one that I showed you at the very beginning with the kind of the light grazing. This was another study, cereal rye grazing. This was a 3-year study. And again, we just don't really see a negative impact There was no significant differences due to cover crop or grazing, but again, short term, 3 years. I think the point here is that at least we're not seeing huge negative impacts, and so that's a benefit. Soil microbial biomass. Well, tells us part of the story, right, about the biology. We know that there's a lot to the soil biology and diversity, and it's really hard to interpret sometimes, like should our targets be? In general, most people think about if we get more soil biology, that's a positive thing. In this case, we see a mixed bag. We have some studies where they show a positive benefit above the cover crop alone. So that's about 30% of the time. 30% of the time it saw no effect, and then about 30% of the time it was mixed effect. And really a mixed effect is in 1 year they might see it and the next year they might not. So what's going on there, I don't really know. But I do think that this is something, there's not a lot of studies, as you can see. We need more data, but we probably need more data on what does it mean, right? So what should we be targeting in terms of the diversity in the soil? So I told you about this study on oats. We also, at that same time, we were planting on high moisture corn. So that was basically about 2 weeks later that we would harvest high moisture corn and plant into it. And you can see this is how much biomass we got. Okay, so not very much. And I just wanted to show you what the soil microbial biomass looked like. So we have soil respiration on that silage and the high moisture corn. This is no cover, no graze, cover crop, no graze, and cover crop grazed. And we really didn't see any differences. And this was a 6-year study. But the thing I have to point out about this being a 6-year study is that we were rotating between corn and beans. So it's only 3 years of grazing or not grazing and planting a cover crop. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's still, again, relatively short term. But I think the thing that really pops out to me is what's going on here with our high moisture corn. This seems like when we have that high amount of carbon available, right? Remember, corn silage and soybeans, not a lot of carbon in that system left on the soil. But when we have some carbon, that's where having this maybe more nitrogen-rich cover crop and grazing seem to have something going on there. So cash crop yields. This is the one thing that's more consistent in terms of measurement. 60% of the time, no effect. 30% of the time, it was a mixed effect. And what I really mean is some years they'd see a positive, some years they'd see a negative, some years they'd see no effect. And we had one study where they saw an increase. So what's going on there? Well, again, I think there's a lot of very system-specific things, but the negative impacts seem to be pretty consistently correlated with low water availability and reducing the amount of residue on the land. So I think that's useful to understand because we have to remember that these are complex systems. And so it's really simple to say, this is what you're going to see. And just like saying, putting cattle on the land is always good. Well, depends, right? It depends on management, depends on the system. In this case, the couple studies where they saw an impact, this is what they correlated it to. And in fact, we've seen the same thing. This is a study where we were doing a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, and we plant a cover crop after wheat. And then we would graze the corn residue, and then we graze the cover crop after wheat. And in the soybean phase in this particular year, you can see this is drought stressed, and this is not drought stressed. So this is non-grazed with a cover crop after the wheat, and then so this is 2 years after that, if that makes sense. But here's the thing. We got a 10 bushel decrease, and if you went out into that field after the corn phase, even though we actually did not graze, even to our recommended rates, we didn't have a lot of residue left by the time those beans were in May and April. And that's really because we actually also did see some stimulation of the microbial biomass, which is a positive thing, but can also be a negative thing, right? Like, it depends. If I've got a lot of carbon on the ground, I want more microbes, right, to be degrading that and moving that through the system. But if I don't have a lot, then I get into trouble, right? So I think sometimes we like to make things way more simple than they really are. Okay, so I also wanted to show you this one, which is a fall grazing study. It was after wheat again. We baled the straw. They planted a 5-way mix. I did not pick the mix. And the 5-way mix, it actually had radishes and turnips in it at way too high of a rate. I think it was 5 pounds total when you put those two together. What happened was the biomass was 70% brassica. And you can see our calves were quite loose. I think they gained about 1.5 pounds a day. Some more fiber would have helped that situation a bit. But here's the thing I really wanted to point out. We're talking about the soil. In this system, they were putting on all the nitrogen for the corn as manure from the feedlot. And then they did that. They planted this cover crop. Can you imagine the nitrate levels? They were quite high. But here's what happened in the subsequent corn yield. So if we look at, compared to the control, having that cover crop tied up some of that nitrogen and decreased the yield of that corn. And if we grazed it, we recovered some of that. Statistically, we recovered it all. Numerically, you can see we didn't. Probably we cycled more of that nitrogen through and made it available for the corn more quickly. Again, my point here is that systems matter, right? That it depends on the situation. And again, there was no additional nitrogen added, so there's no starter fertilizer or anything like that, which is important to understand because we were tying up some of that. So, can you have your cake and eat it too? It depends. That would be my answer. But we need more research on the key variables to what it depends on, right? We need to understand how to manage the soil and manage our grazing and our interactions and figure out which systems it makes the most sense and where it's going to be beneficial. And if I think about it, the key research needs, number one, I think it's the theme of all of these sessions, we need long-term research, right? We need to look at cumulative impacts. The one and dones are probably very misleading. 3 years is probably very misleading, just to be frank about how it works in the system. We do a lot of physical properties because they're easy. We need to get into more of the chemical and biological, and I realize that's expensive. All of this I'm talking about takes money, right? Stocking density and biomass removal rates are really, really important, and nobody does it, right? We either graze or we don't graze. We need to start looking at that as a treatment. And then evaluating timing of grazing. Dormant grazing, once the plant's done versus in the growing season, I think is really important relative to plant growth as well as soil conditions. And then, you know, the roots are key, and nobody assesses impacts on root growth, especially with removal rates in annuals. And perennials and annuals are not the same, guys. So we really do need to do some more evaluation in that area. All right. With that, I think I'm on time, right? I was close to on time.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yes, sir.
In your studies that you were doing and everything under the, like with corn residue as opposed to the silage where there was no residue, were you tracking temperature, soil temperature at all?
So we actually did measure soil temperatures in the spring. And honestly, we couldn't really see big differences in our soil temperatures, but that was because we were only doing it in the spring. And probably by the time we would actually see huge differences, it would be once we had canopy cover of the soybeans. So we really didn't pick up a whole lot of differences, just to be frank. We've done it with corn residue grazing as well, and we really don't see it with corn residue grazing either. Baling, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Thank you, Dr. Duanowski.
Thank you, guys.
So our next speaker is Dr. Jose Dubé. He is from the University of Florida. So we're going to go from the extreme west of the east back over to more central part of the eastern coast.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this session. I think it's an important topic for us to discuss, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to travel with you from the north to the south, go to the coastal plains, and that's our scenario down there, where if you put Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, we have around 4 million acres of row crop, which is about 1.6 million hectares. And around 5% of this land has cover crops. So 95% doesn't do anything when they harvest the cotton, the peanut, the corn in October until April next year, or March, April next year. So so that's what we see. So there's a huge opportunity to integrate cover crops in this system. And I believe people are aware of the benefits of cover crops. We've been talking about that for a long time. So I think that the economic is one of the most important things. And we need to find systems that can pay for those cover crops. So that would bring economic advantages and also all the other benefits that you know about cover crop. So this land on the right, it's follow from October until April. We could have that on that same land, grazing. And in the coastal plains, we have 100 to 120 days of grazing. From October, and most of these land have irrigation, so we have opportunities to plant as soon as you harvest. And I know some folks doing that. So there's a big opportunity to do that in that region. And we all know that cover crops and could help in different things, like reducing nutrient loss to the environment, bridge, the row crop to the next row crop by, holding and recycling those nutrients. Could also, if you integrate livestock, provide economic development for the region, produce more food. And I've hearing from the folks that are doing that in many cases when you graze the cover crops, you can also have some increase in the yields of the row crop. So let's talk a bit more about grazing cover crops. So grazing recycle nutrients, and we have some data that I'm going to show here that can also reduce nitrate leaching, which is a big problem in Florida, at least in that region. We can help bridging those nutrients from the cropping seasons, improve row crop yields, and also pay for these costs. Some producers, row crop producers, are saying that the grazing doesn't leave a lot of money for them, but it's saving around 30% of the fertilizer cost in the next crop. And that's a big thing with the high prices of fertilizer. So that's something that we need to dig deeper, in my opinion. And again, cool season is the prime time in the Southeast to put gains. Animals gains almost 1 kilogram per day just on grass, water, and minerals. That's it. So that's the best time. So I keep saying one month of grazing cool season is equal to 3 months grazing bahia grass in terms of animal performance. So that's the best time for us to put gains. So that's we need to take that opportunity. So the plants, they put together the carbon and nitrogen, and the rumen microbes, they decouple those carbon and nitrogens. And they do it in a way that is very efficient and promotes the nutrient cycling. Long time ago, we did a trial in situ bags, both in the field or inside the rumen, comparing the endpoint of the decomposition. And it was very interesting that the end point was very similar, both incubating the bag with the litter in the field for 256 days compared to a few days in the rumen. So the rumen bugs can do in a few hours what takes almost a year to do in the field. So they're much more efficient. So I'm going to show some data in terms of cotton and peanut yield that we have in our systems in Mariana, Florida. We're comparing different grazing intensities or no grazing at all, or presence of cover crops or no cover crop. And one of the interesting data that we found on peanut yield, for example, is that integrating crop and livestock and grazing those cover crops we found greater peanut production in that region. For cotton, we didn't find difference. It was pretty much the same. We had very good cotton yield this year, but we didn't find any difference. And we had a big range of treatments here, no cover crops or cover crops and no graze, or different grazing intensities of cover crops. That's some data from Brazil, where they compared two systems. That's soybean, followed by grazing, and soybean again. And they tried two different species of, two different new varieties of grass, of brachiaria grass. And this other one is soybean, corn, and soybean, the traditional rotation. They found interesting data showing greater soybean yield whenever you had the crop livestock integration compared to the rotation with maize. Let's shift gear and talk a little bit about nitrate leaching. That's a very serious problem in several regions of the world. That's next, to our experimental station. We have this first magnitude spring, and that's the story there. That's nitrate concentration in the water. It's a linear increase in the last 30 years or so. Big increase in nitrate in the water. So what can we do to reduce this problem there? And they also found that most of this nitrate comes from agriculture. So we end up installing some drain lysimeters and try to find out how the different management of cover crops could affect the nitrate leaching. And what we found, well, I put at the top the best, the good, and the ugly. The best was grazing cover crop. We reduced nitrate leaching when we graze cover crops. The good was cover crop without grazing, and the ugly was the fallow. This paper was just published in the Journal of Environmental Quality. Not sure if Eric Santos is here, but he led that publication. That's cumulative nitrate leaching, no cover crop, cover crop. So here, the less you have, the better. So cover crop reduced nitrate leaching. Grazing or no grazing. Grazing also reduced nitrate leaching. No grazing, or we have two systems, integrated crop livestock system or the sod-based rotation, which has a perennial grass, bahia grass. But in both cases, we reduce leaching compared to non-grazing. So grazing, in this case, reduced nitrate leaching. We also found interesting that the cool season, the winter time, is the hot spot for nitrate leaching. So that increased the importance of putting cover crop in this time of the year. Well, at least in Florida, it keeps raining, but the temperatures are low, so evapotranspiration reduce, and the water, instead of going up, go down and increase leaching. Some little work that we did in those systems, above and below ground litter, brought some interesting results. That's above ground litter nitrogen disappearance, and below ground. Just see the book of the numbers. Below ground is much more important than above ground. So we never think about the roots, but they're much more important in terms of bridging and releasing those nutrients to the next crop. Another thing, we did grazing, no grazing with some fertilizer, or no grazing at the similar levels of fertilizer that we have on the grazing system, so to make sure that you're comparing the similar things. And then we have overgrazing, which was, leaving 500 kilograms of biomass as a stubble residue. Moderate grazing left 1,500, and undergrazing was 2,500 kilograms of biomass. What was interesting to me, it was not a big difference. There was no difference actually here, and I surely thought that the overgrazing would reduce a lot, this nitrogen. What happened is that, yes, there was less biomass, but the concentration of nitrogen was higher, and lower CN ratio, and that at the end you release pretty much the same, although you still end up with some greater stock of nitrogen at the end. But in terms of releasing rates, was similar. But the take-home message here is that the below ground was much more important than the above ground. That's the cotton removal in that system, removal of nitrogen from the system. And at the beginning is very low. So if you want to match whatever you're releasing for the cover crop, if the cotton at the beginning is going to be very low demand for nitrogen, and that's days, 16 days, 32. And then at some point starts to increase a lot. But at the end, you see the levels of nitrogen that we are accumulating the cotton crop is a lot. So just that liter is not enough to supply nutrients for that cotton. Important thing here was on the soil side, cover crop reduced the soil bulk density in our case. Those are the numbers. Soil with cover crop, 1.49. Soil with no cover crop, 1.72. Another important thing here is that grazing did not affect soil bulk density here. As you can see, the p-value, and that's the cover crop of grazing versus no grazing. They were very similar. So cover crop helped to reduce soil bulk density, and grazing had no effect. We're doing some crazy things there, and I don't have data to show for this one because we are still doing it. But you're now enriching some of this cover crop with N15 urea because you want to understand more why when you put animals to graze, we reduce nitrate leaching. So we're trying to follow the processes. So we are enriching the cover crop with N15, putting the animals to graze, collecting dung and urine from those animals and incubating to see different processes like greenhouse gas, ammonia volatilization, nitrous oxide emission, nitrate leaching from those things. It was interesting, that's the N15 in the dung and the urine of those animals. That's the baseline. But after one day, we already started, looking at some enrichment in the excreta. But we used to incubate the excreta that we collect in the third day to make sure that we had enough enrichment. We're measuring also how that nitrogen moves in a radius. This is like the dung pad, and this we are sampling at different radius, and we are measuring the cover crop greenhouse gas emission from that system, and also CO2 evolution. We're also doing some work on below ground on root turnover to see how that pool helps to promote the soil organic matter and release nutrients. In terms of soil organic matter formation, we are also enriching some of those cover crops with carbon-13 and N15, and we are incubating later and try to track the carbon and nitrogen in those cover crops in soil organic matter formation, microbial pool, and greenhouse gas as well. One concept that I want to bring here, and that's I would say that folks in southern Brazil are doing that for some years already, and that's something that we need to think about, is the concept of system fertilization, where you're not really just fertilizing the cover crops, but also some of that fertility is going to help the following row crop. In this example here, they did different combinations of fertilizer. This is the cover crop phase where they are grazing or not grazing. In this case, not grazing, here grazing, as you see the animal. But they are putting all the nitrogen here in the cover crop phase and the P and K here, and this is soybean. Or they are doing all the NPK here and not putting anything here. Or they're just, whenever they integrate the animals, there are similar set of treatments. Nitrogen here and P and K here, or everything here, and grazing or not grazing. So they found that a greater herbage accumulation rate in the system fertilization compared with conventional crop fertilization. So that helped the cover crop phase for sure. And if you have animals, that translates into better animal performance in the system. The integrated crop livestock system presented greater system productivity compared to just the cropping system, regardless of fertilization strategies. And soybean yield in this case was not affected by fertilization strategy or grazing. So that's something that we need to think, because that's, like I said, one of the plus that I heard from a producer in Florida. He said, the big plus here is that I'm saving 30% of my fertilizer bill when I integrate livestock in the system. So I think we need to dig deeper into that, study the system as a whole, not only those little components, because one affect the other. Whatever you're putting in the cover crop phase, and it will affect the row crop phase, and they are connected. And that reduction in fertilization need, it's really important. So just a quick, that's my last one. We are trying to, like Dr. Paulo Carvalho mentioned, we are trying to reconnect the cropping systems with livestock systems, and that's a project that you have now, where if you are a livestock guy willing to partner with a row crop farmer, you can create your pin here and put there, where you're going to provide some information on if you're willing to to haul water, to install fences and things like that. And likewise, if you are a land-based producer, you have land available and is willing to share with somebody to bring cattle to graze, you can also create your pin, and then you can hit the button and connect those farmers. It's like a dating app, right? To match a matchmaker to put together row crop farmers and livestock producers. Well, take-home message: grazing cover crops, I think, enhances nutrient cycling, and in our experience, reduce nitrate leaching. Grazing, again, in our experience in the coastal plains, either enhanced or did not change the crop yield. System fertilization, I think that's something that we need to dig deeper. And the cover crop can, adding livestock to the cover crop system, to the crop system, can help to pay for the cover crop, and that will increase the long-term sustainability. Instead of having producers waiting for government money to plant cover crop, let's find systems that they can pay for themselves, and in the long term will be more sustainable. I'd like to thank all the team, the forest team, and that has been helping in all of these activities. It's a big team, so I didn't put names here, but it's a big group. Thank you very much. That's a great question, and we're trying to investigate further into that. That's why we're doing all that isotope stuff. I feel, and I think, maybe we're shifting the nitrogen instead of going down. Some of that might be going up as ammonia volatilization or even some nitrous oxide emission. That's a possibility. But we are trying. We know that it happens, but we don't know the answer yet.
I see that on your cover crops are mainly grasses. Did you try any annual legumes to include in those grasses as well?
Yes, that's a great question. Actually, this picture here, we have a mix of grasses and legumes. In the first phase of this research, we only had grass, but now we're integrating more legumes to try to cut back the nitrogen fertilizer. So some of the treatments that you have right now is just grass and legumes without any nitrogen input from fertilizer. So yes, we are doing that right now.
Dr. Dubé is going to have to excuse himself in a little bit to go to a different talk because he's in high demand. But I think he'll be around this afternoon later, so if you have more questions, feel free to find him and he'd answer those for us. Our next talk, we're going to be moving a little further north from the Gulf of Mexico up into, starting to get into the upper south. So our next speaker is Dr. Deidre Harmon, and she's from North Carolina State University.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go ahead and let you guys know of all my southern colleagues. I'm definitely the most northern part of this talk. I'm in the mountains between Asheville, North Carolina, and Tennessee, so I'm the highest elevation. I deal with a much colder weather than the other presentations probably that you're going to hear about today. So I've been challenged with talking about extending the grazing season through a combination of different cover crops. And so I really want to start this off by thinking about this of what is a cover crop, and you're all probably thinking, well, we all know what a cover crop is. But if you ask different parts of our industry, you may actually get a different response about what a cover crop is. If you think about what the Soil Science Society of America thinks about a cover crop, if you think about what maybe a row crop farmer will define as a cover crop, and then what a livestock farmer may define as a cover crop, you may get a different answer. And so just kind of thinking about this, doing some literature research, the Soil Science Society of America defines a cover crop as being a close-growing crop that provides soil protection, seeding protection, and soil improvement between periods of normal crop protection or between trees and orchards and vines and vineyards. So if you notice, there's nothing that has to do anything with animal performance in that definition of what a cover crop is. So for somebody that has an interest in soils, they may not actually be thinking about the improvements that we get out of grazing it from a livestock perspective. A row crop farmer, they may be thinking about the direct and indirect costs and effects on soil and maybe the future cash crop and how that can impact different economics down the road, different pest and disease management or issues that they may have. And from a livestock perspective, and I'm a livestock person, I have cattle at home, I'm thinking about, well, that's a source of underutilized forage that we can take and graze to extend the grazing season, and that's one less bale of hay that I'm going to have to feed in the wintertime is really what I'm thinking about. But for many of us, we're cross-trained in a lot of these different segments, so we're actually looking at the bigger picture of how all this fits in together and how all these are related. So what are some benefits of cover crops? Well, there's a lot of different benefits when we start thinking about that big picture view. Increase in filtration rates that we've already talked about in the previous talks, help maintain soil moisture by utilizing that cover crop, maybe alleviate some soil compaction by allowing those roots to penetrate deep into that soil profile, help allow some weed suppression of some of those maybe winter annual weeds that we see, increase nutrient cycling efficiency that was just discussed, allow those cover crops to go and scavenge out some of those nutrients in the soil. It may be an additional farm enterprise for a lot of our farmers. They may be able to contract graze that cover crop in the wintertime or in the springtime, so that can be an additional venture for them. It may be a source of high quality forage for our livestock guys. It helps extend the grazing season, reduce winter feeding costs, and then reduce the need for stored forages, which is I'm a big fan of. So if we think about our different cover crop options, we have a lot of different cover crops that we can utilize in the Southeast. Thinking about our small grains that most of us are probably familiar with, cereal rye is probably one of our more early maturing small grains that we can utilize. Wheat, triticale, and oats, triticale being that cross between cereal rye and wheat. And then thinking about oats as we move further north, moving from Florida up from Georgia to Alabama and to the North Carolina where I'm at, we actually have probably less opportunity to utilize oats because of their potential to winter kill in our system. So we don't get a lot of benefit of planting oats in our system in the fall. We also have the option to utilize annual ryegrass in our systems, and you're probably thinking, well, annual ryegrass, we don't want to plant annual ryegrass on top of maybe a bean field or a cotton field, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some different opportunities and different ways of thinking about cover crops in a second. Other cover crop options include legumes. We've got a lot of different legumes that we can utilize. Crimson clover being one of my favorites, that if I drive from North Carolina to Florida and I stop through Georgia in the springtime, you just basically see a sea of red of crimson clover that's germinated on the roadsides. Bog clover, airleaf clover, berseem, Australian winter pea is a popular one in North Carolina, and hairy vetch can all be utilized. And their role in these cover crop systems is really a couple of areas to help extend the grazing season by mixing them in with some of these cereal grains that we've talked about. Fix nitrogen into from the atmosphere into the soil, and hopefully allow some nitrogen to be there for our next cash crop that we're going to be planting. And then really one that we often don't think about is how they play this big role into functional ecosystems. I have a lot of farmers in North Carolina that are also beef farmers, if you will, and so they love that added benefit of having that crimson clover or some type of legume in that cover crop, because that actually provides a feed source for their bees early in spring as well that we often don't think about. So if we think about these legumes and kind of the role that they play, they can provide quite a bit of tonnage in our cover crop systems. I've put on the display two different studies that I really like, one being from North Carolina and one being much further down in Georgia. And kind of two things that I want you to notice about this slide. Is one in North Carolina. This was a 2-year study, and across different legume species, we found that we had over 3,000 kilograms per hectare tonnage of these different legume species that we're very proud of overseeding these into Bermuda grass pastures. In Georgia, we had 2 different locations where those different species were planted, and what we noticed was that soil type and obviously weather and rainfall does play a difference in tonnage, as we all know, but overall, from location, environmental differences, typically we see about 2,500 kilograms per hectare of tonnage off of our different legume species. One thing to note about our trial from Freeman et al. In North Carolina is that we did see some differences in the maturity rate of these different legume species. And so that's something to keep in mind when we start thinking about extending the grazing season and how can we start pairing some of these different legume forages together to really help us get the most amount of forage and grazing days out of our pastures. And so one thing I want to note is that our crimson clover and our winter peas started to mature much earlier than our forage legumes. They've started to develop seed, and then they started to die in these pasture systems much earlier than our arrowleaf clover and our hairy vetch. And when we start comparing, especially crimson clover and arrowleaf clover, that's not something that we didn't expect, if you will. Crimson clover is known to be a mid-maturing forage legume, whereas arrowleaf clover is known to be a mid to late maturing forage legume. And oftentimes in the literature, you're going to see a lot of arrowleaf clover and crimson clover planted together to take advantage of those different maturing rates. Other cover crop options that we have are different types of brassicas like rape turnip, and depending on where you may be throughout the U.S., maybe using some kale radish and some hybrids as well. We've got a lot of benefits to using these different brassicas, and I will say that I think their popularity has increased probably in the last 10 to 15 years, possibly due to social media and some of the websites where there's been a lot of talk about the benefits of using, some of you are laughing in the crowd, a lot of the benefits of using brassicas in our grazing systems when it comes to soil health. They are fast establishing. We can see some early grazing out of these cover crop options in the fall. They are very high nutrient value, both when we start thinking about the tops and maybe some of the tubers that are growing below ground. We can have somewhere between 65 to 80% TDN and upwards of somewhere between 9 and 16% crude protein, which is enough nutritive value for a mature cow that is lactating and has a calf by her side. We do have some challenges with these brassicas in our cover crop systems. They do require a high soil pH. They do have a lack. They don't like for residue to be there when we plant them, so it does kind of create some challenges from a management standpoint when incorporating them into cover crop systems. As it's already been stated, they lack effective fiber, so we have a problem with just planting a solid stand of brassicas and then getting out there and grazing them. And then they do have a low regrowth potential, primarily from damaging of that growing point on the top of that bulb that we can have an issue with. A study by Larry et al., our friends out in the western part of the U.S., looked at grazing these different forage species of brassicas for early fall grazing. And one thing that I want you to notice in this system is that they had a lot of growth within about 60 days after planting. They grazed it, and then they came back and grazed those forage brassicas every 30 days after that initial grazing. And so what they found is that in that first 60 days of grazing, they had about 2,100 kilograms per hectare of forage growth. But then after that, that growth rapidly declined in this system. So they got a lot of grazing early on, and then they didn't have a lot of grazing thereafter. Total yield in their grazing trial was somewhere between about 24 to about 3,100 kilograms per hectare in this study. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and think about our different opportunities we have for using cover crops for grazing here in the southeastern U.S. And after we can maybe argue or agree or disagree about kind of how I'm using this terminology of cover crops. But opportunity number one in the southeast, what we really see are cover crops for warm season perennial systems, specifically in Bermuda grass and Bahia grass systems here in the southeast. And so when we start thinking about our warm season perennial systems and specifically Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, we know that starting in spring, going through summer and early fall, we get a lot of production, forage growth of Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, or our warm season perennial grasses. But where you see in this growing system that we lack is that fall growth, that winter growth, and that early spring growth. So if we can do something to add some forage into that system so that we can continue to graze when Bermuda grass and Bahia grass are not growing well, we can take advantage of some of these different cover crops that we have. Particularly in these systems, where we see a lot of farmers taking advantage of is ryegrass specifically. There's about 1.1 million hectares of ryegrass planted annually here in the southeast. And mainly it's really easy to establish ryegrass in some of our warm season perennial pastures. It's very high in nutritive value. It's not very hard to get it established like maybe some of our other species. It can tolerate some I guess, hiccups in planting establishment, planting depth much more than some of our other species. So we see it utilized quite extensively here in the southeast. And so when we start thinking about extending the grazing system in these warm season pastures, we can think about, well, is ryegrass our best option, or can we start mixing in some of these different cover crop options that we have to really start to extend the grazing season? And I really like the study done by Hovland et al. In 1978, looking at, well, is ryegrass our best option, or do we have different options that we can incorporate? And so what he found was by adding ryegrass and overseeding ryegrass into Bermuda grass pastures, they were able to extend that grazing season by about 30 days. But when he started looking at some of these other cover crop mixtures, like arrowleaf and crimson clover, he extended that grazing season by 60 days. And then when he added cereal rye into that mixture, he was able to extend that grazing season by about 90 days. So if you notice, just about the only month on this calendar here with that rye, arrowleaf, crimson, and Bermuda mix that he wasn't able to cover in grazing was that December time frame. So some other cow-calf performance on coastal Bermuda grass, overseeded with annual clovers and grasses. I really like this study. Again, this is the 1978 study. He also wanted to look at not only grazing days, but both cow gain and calf gain, both per hectare and per animal in this study. And so what he found is that compared to just Bermuda grass alone, he not only increased calf gain per hectare, calf gain per head, but also cow gain as well. So some other opportunities that we have here in the southeast, and this one is probably really unique to my situation and where I'm at in North Carolina, but this may pertain to some others that are in the tall fescue belt, is cover crops for cool season perennial grass systems. This is something I get asked about quite often in my area, is how we can use cover crops in a tall fescue-based grass system. And it gets a little more challenging here, right? Because if we think about tall fescue and how it grows, it's a little bit different than our warm season perennial forages. We have a lot of growth. In the springtime, we get that big springtime flush. In the summertime, tall fescue starts to go not dormant, but it doesn't grow quite as well in the summertime. And then in the fall, we get that big flush of tall fescue growth again. And then this gives us a lot of opportunities, as you can see, that we can stockpile that tall fescue. That tall fescue actually maintains its nutrient value very well into wintertime. So we actually can defer grazing of tall fescue to help us get into that winter time frame. Now, our biggest challenge with a tall fescue-based system is kind of this transition from when we finish grazing our tall fescue stockpile until that tall fescue decides it wants to grow again in the spring. Now, For the most part, overseeding of winter annual species into tall fescue-based systems is pretty much has been unsuccessful for us. Unlike Bermuda grass or Bahia grass systems, we can't go in there with a drill and overseed ryegrass or overseed a cereal grain and it be very successful. Usually in that type of situation, we get greatly reduced yields and therefore our cost of establishment goes way high. So we've looked at, in Georgia, they've done a little bit of work looking at trying to establish different brassicas, specifically T. raptor, on different types of establishment methods, thinking, well, maybe this is something that we could adapt in our fescue-based systems. We can go in and establish T. raptor in our tall fescue-based systems. But what they found throughout their different strategies, whether it was conventional till, they had a no-till system where they just mowed that herbage off, a no-till where they burned that herbage off, or the no-till where they just left that residue. They found that the hybrid turnip did not fare well when there was any type of residue based on that ground. So we found that this is not going to work well in our system. We also know that cool season annual usage is really limited in our area to cash crop rotations, or we need a dedicated area where we have a summer annual, winter annual rotation. So in our area, we have mainly corn silage production, very little cotton in the mountains of North Carolina, some corn grain production, but very little opportunities for true livestock integrated cash crop systems. So we looked at doing some summer annual, winter annual rotations in the mountains of North Carolina, specifically using ryegrass because that's what the gold standard seems to be in the southeast. And what we found is that ryegrass in our area doesn't really pair well with the tall fescue growing conditions in North Carolina. We also looked at pairing ryegrass with crimson clover, thinking we could extend our fescue-based growing seasons in this system. And what we found is by the time that ryegrass decided to actually grow, most of our producers were already turning their cattle out on tall fescue-based systems. So really this was a waste, and they said that it just basically stayed there and didn't grow until they already had fescue. So really mid-April timeframe was really when we really saw a lot of tonnage production in our ryegrass-based systems, and you can see there that's what the fescue looked like during that same time frame. And then really when ryegrass started to really rock and roll, we already had seed head production in our tall fescue. So we think that this ryegrass system doesn't work in our system in the mountains. A little bit of more work on this. We also planted rye, triticale, wheat with and without crimson clover, and we think some of those more early maturing cover crop species is a much better idea for us in our system. Lastly, the cover crops in a true cash crop system that we mostly think about when we think about cover crops is really probably our biggest opportunity, like it's already been said, in the southeast for increasing our grazing systems. Increased use of cover crops is on the rise with quite a bit more interest here in the southeast with kind of using that integrated crop livestock systems. The forage can be grazed and continue to provide some agronomic benefits. The good news is most of the literature shows that there's not a negative impact on the following crop after grazing. There's a lot of pros and cons to using both mixtures and monocultures. The pros of using a mixture is that we get a greater forage distribution by starting to pair some of those maturities together. We get increased animal performance, and then as already been shown in some of the previous data, we do see some nutrient cycling benefits. Some cons of mixtures that I often hear about is potential increased seed cost of starting to put some of those 3, 4, 5, 6-way mixes together. Questions and concerns about seeding rates and seeding depths when we start getting some of these really small seeds paired with some of our larger seeds like wheat. Where is that actual sweet spot for seeding depth and seeding rate when we're mixing that in the same drill together? And then a lot of times success depends on weather, and sometimes that's a hard sell when you've had a failure after failure because of weather, and so sometimes we get burnout based on that, or a lot of our producers do. So cover crops and cotton rotations, we know it works. This study looked at planting different cover crops. They had no effect on the following lint yield based on the cover crop. And then we have some data here from Arkansas looking at the effect of cool season annual mixture and stalker production. And so some of the story that I want you to take home here is when we start pairing some of these different cover crop species together, especially some of our small grains, we start to extend that grazing season. We start to get some increased benefits by adding those days of grazing on there, and we can start to increase our net return per acre on some of these situations. So lastly, I'm going to leave you with this. I really like the study from Alabama looking at the lack of adoption of cover crops in the southeast. There was a questionnaire that was sent out to about 1,200 participants in Alabama. They had a 23% response rate that represented about 19% of the total land area of row crops in Alabama. They were asked if they've used a cover crop in the last 3 years. 66% of them said yes, which was about 301 respondents. 200 respondents of the total 301 respondents that they received. They were asked if they perceived any yield gain from planting that cover crop, and 37% said yes. 53% said they did bale or graze that cover crop, but only 0.07% said they planted a legume as a cover crop. So lots of opportunities to increase our cover crop opportunities in the southeast. However, we've obviously got some infrastructure challenges when we think about planting this on cover crops on cotton fields or soybean fields, peanut fields. Most of those don't have the infrastructure that we need to go ahead and graze those. So we've got to think about that. So other perceptions, that we've got to overcome: crop yield depression, disease pressure, pest issues, costs, don't have the time to go plant a cover crop because I'm still harvesting cotton, and animal husbandry training. So with that, grazing cover crops can be a great way to decrease stored forage needs, increase the grazing season, and then one shoe does not fit all in all situations. So with that, I'll take any questions.
We don't have time for questions, but Dr. Harmon will be around. Find her if you have any questions about her presentation. Our next talk will be moving up the Appalachian mountain chain into Pennsylvania and looking at how some of these systems can be incorporated in a more northern, mid-Atlantic type environment.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the invitation by the IGC and by Dr. Dillard to present this data that we have, and also I appreciate the crowd in here, because for being the last afternoon of the conference, I'm impressed. I'm going to talk today about a project that we've been doing that's part of a long-term project. I have a couple years of data. We're just now putting it together, but looking at integrating these livestock and cropping systems by putting cereal rye into corn for late season and actually early spring grazing as well. So to back up a little bit and give a little historical perspective, before World War II, many farms in the U.S. and around the world were more or less subsistence farming. They were producing crops and forages and animals and meat products and milk products and fiber for themselves, their local communities, a little bit of sales, but it didn't go very far, right? But once they were very diversified farms. They had multiple types of crops, multiple types of livestock, just a very diversified farm. But after World War II, when things became much more industrialized and our economy became much more global, farms started to become more specialized, and we had this decoupling of crops and livestock. And so they became very specialized to market to international markets, to take advantage of larger machinery, to take advantage of larger processing plants for livestock and so forth. But they became very input intensive, because where you might have had an animal harvesting a crop or taking care of a weed, maybe now we needed a chemical to do that. Or maybe where we're providing forage for an animal, we had to purchase it. So we had a lot more play between farms, but they were very separated. And as of 2010, a study showed that large family and non-family farms accounted for 10% of all farms in the U.S., but provided 75% of the sales. So what does that tell you about the size of the farms, the specialization of the farms? And there have been a lot of advantages to that, but there's also some drawbacks. So why specialization? We talked about a couple of these already. We're meeting international demand for raw products and for processed products. And the processing industry has certainly driven a lot of the specialization. Look at how much corn and a lot of wheat and a lot of our products are processed. Even our meat products are processed into something other than the raw product. Capture that economies of scale. If I'm going to have a piece of machinery, if I have a milking parlor, I want to use it as much as I can. So we're going to increase our farm and utilize those facilities to their capacity. The machinery developments, of course, with the technology and the increased size of machinery, we were able to harvest a lot more acreage than we were in the past. And then there's a lot of government incentives for export markets, which has driven a lot of the specialization. So there's been a return to interest in integrating these crops and livestock systems. We have a lot more pressure on ourselves to produce more food on the same or even the shrinking land base. We're losing agricultural land all the time. Human population is growing. How are we going to supply food for these people? We need to produce more food on the same or less land. But at the same time, what's the cost to the environment? We want to be able to do this without hurting, at the very least, or at the best, improving our environmental conditions for ourselves and for future generations. So while there's positives to the specialization of farms, there's certainly a lot of negatives that we need to consider. You're reducing water quality and groundwater supplies. If we're using more irrigation, if we have more erosion, if we have more nutrient leaching, we're depleting soil organic matter. If we're harvesting off a lot of nutrients and we're taking a lot of the carbon out of the soil, but we're not replacing it. Sedimentation of reservoirs. If we have this runoff, where's it going? It's going into our reservoirs and our water supplies. And we all know we have eutrophication of some of our waterways, the Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf of Mexico in the U.S., and many other places around the world. We have increased insect pressures, where there used to be maybe diverse crops or diverse forages that may have kept insects in control, or animals that harvested, or just a variety of more natural ways to control pests. We've lost those with the specialization, so we now have to do it with greater inputs. These could be fossil fuel inputs, chemical inputs, mechanical inputs, a lot of things that we need to use. And with the advent of a lot of our herbicide-resistant crops, we're now getting these super weeds, right? Herbicide-resistant weeds. So what do we need to do to keep them under control? As it develop another chemical and then it becomes resistant to that, develop another chemical, it becomes resistant to that. Or are there ways we can integrate our systems again? Maybe we can have livestock graze those weeds and then we don't have near the problem. And increase crop diseases again, because you lose that diversity, and you might lose interseeded or intermixed crops or forages that may have attracted a disease or prevented disease in a crop that's no longer there. So why integrate? We've talked about that quite a bit, because monocropping is simpler, right? Whether it's animals or forages, our crops. If we just have one class of animal, if we just have one crop, we have one management plan, right? But if we start adding different enterprises, we add a whole complexity. And some farmers aren't good managers. And if you're adding all these different complexities, if I have a crop system and I'm going to add livestock, Dr. Harmon talked about the infrastructure. There's just a lot of things we have to consider to add these enterprises to another one. Again, we need that greater management. And so what is the incentive? And that's where we want to come in to start showing where some of this is beneficial in the long term and the short term. So what we're looking at is greater productivity of both enterprises. And what I'm talking about both here is the forage and the animal. And I lump them in that at this point, while increasing the long-term sustainability of the whole farm system. We want to add these enterprises on the same land base, but we don't want to be robbing the land of nutrients or of soil or organic matter or whatever it is. We want to keep adding to it and maintain that productivity and health, not only for our own profitability and our own sustainability, but for the future. If we're adding, if we have a livestock enterprise and we want to add some more cropping systems, or we want to graze some cropping systems, we're adding feed sources for that livestock. So maybe we can carry more livestock on that land. Again, I'm not going to get into the negatives of this, but just looking at if we have more feed, we can keep more animals, right? There's trade-offs to that, but that's just one possibility. Conserving soil and manure nutrients. We might have a better place to apply our manure, especially if we have more animals. But if we're under nutrient management plans, I'm in the Chesapeake Bay region of the Northeast, and we have a lot of phosphorus issues in our soils. And a lot of our farmers are restricted in nutrient application, manure application, because of phosphorus. There's nitrogen restrictions, but phosphorus will get people before nitrogen will a lot of times. But if we have a crop that can suck up that phosphorus, if we have a crop that can use something symbiotic there, we may be able to apply more of that manure and not have to look for greater land bases or other places to export manure. For reducing nutrient losses relative to specialized and separate cropping systems. So if we can keep that soil in place by adding another enterprise, that's certainly a benefit. Improve farm profitability. We're looking at diversifying our income. If one enterprise is down, if beef prices are down, corn prices may be high. If you can look at different things and balance it out. When one's high, one may be low, and we can look at our diversified income. Because many of our farms in the United States, but particularly in the Northeast, are landlocked. They can't just add more land to add more enterprises. They've got to get more out of what they have. They're landlocked because of prices. Land prices are landlocked because of urban sprawl. So there's just a lot of reasons why they're landlocked. Sometimes they're landlocked because of their own management. They can't handle a bigger property. So they want to be able to get more out of what they have. So we want to increase the output of our farms while minimizing the environmental impact. I know I keep saying that that's really our goal when we're looking at integrating these systems. So in our area and in other regions of the country, when we're looking at corn harvest, if corn is harvested in silage in late August, early September, we can usually get a cover crop in after that, and it'll establish well and maintain over the summer. But when the corn is harvested as grain, which is late October, early November, and the growing season's pretty much at an end, we can't put a cover crop in. It just won't establish well. So what can we do to help get a cover crop into this land that will otherwise stand fallow over the winter? Because we'll have soil erosion and nutrient leaching, so we want to get something on there. But these cover crops, they've been planted traditionally for their conservation benefits, right? Hold the soil down, reduce leaching, erosion, and all of that. But it can also be a low-cost source of feed for livestock. And some farms have considered that, and others have not. So, it's cash. I got to let it there. If I graze it, it's going to hurt my next crop. I have to leave it there. And then what do they do in the springtime? They can turn it under for like a green manure, but a lot of times what do? They spray it down, right? And so if we could utilize that and get some income out of that instead of spraying it down, it could be a benefit for the farm. But there are trade-offs between productivity and environmental effects, and they're not always well understood. So we are looking at interseeding the corn crop in a growing state because there's a lot of benefits to that. And there's been a little bit of research on that showing reduced erosion. You can see all these enhancing soil carbon, reducing drought stress, suppressing weeds while that corn is establishing, holding nutrients over the winter if we plant it and it's there after the corn is harvested, making these nutrients available for the next cash crop that's put in, and providing supplemental forage, either in a harvested form or in a grazed form. Some work that was done at Penn State by Bill Kern and Greg Roth a number of years ago looked at interseeding. Which is the middle one? What's that? Anyway, you can see the line there. The first line on the y-axis is no cover crop. That's the corn yield in kilograms per hectare with no cover crop. And you can see as they added red clover, a legume, annual ryegrass, a grass, and then the combination, they got an increase in subsequent corn grain yields as they added those forages, with the combination being the highest. This was a very short-term study, so it doesn't give us those long-term effects of what might be happening on nutrients if we wanted to keep planting corn and not pull it out of rotation. And I know that's kind of a different recommendation than a lot of rotating crops, but there are farms, especially when corn prices are high, they would like to keep putting corn back in. So the objective of our study was to evaluate the long-term effect, which is still ongoing, we don't have long-term effect yet, of interseeding cereal rye into growing corn for late season and early spring grazing. And I'd like to mention that this is part of the Long-Term Agroecosystems Research Network, which is a national network in my agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Research Service. We have 18 funded sites that are doing common experiments across all these locations, and they're nationally, so we have very different climates. And while we may not be doing the exact same experiments, there's common crop experiments, common grazing lands, and then there's the integrated that is becoming more common as some of us say, well, we don't really fall into either category, but we're doing both. And we may not be doing the exact same experiment because I can't do the same thing they're doing maybe in Nebraska or Arizona or some of the other locations, but we're collecting common metrics, common data. We might be all collecting forage biomass yield and soil erosion or livestock gains or whatever it is. And we're trying to make a national network to develop national strategies for efficient agricultural production. And there's kind of a three-legged stool there. You can see sustainability in the middle, and we have the productivity, the environment, and then there's also the rural prosperity. There's this human dimension sector of this as well, which is really new to our agency and new to a lot of agriculture. And while I'm not going to focus on that today, but it is an important component of this LTAR network. So we are collecting these common measures, and this experiment I'm going to explain is part of that long-term network. So we've seen this graph in various forms already today and throughout the week, but when we look at the temperate regions, such as the Northeast United States, this is the growth curve of our perennial cool season grasses, which is very typical. We get that spring flush, which is happening right now. Lots of growth, can't keep up with it. When the summers turn hotter and drier, the growth slows down on these perennial cool season grasses. There could be some legumes in there as well. And then in the fall, we get a smaller or a lower flush of pasture, of forage. So we have two great areas of growth and productivity, but we've got a lot of open area, right? So what we're doing in this study to help fill in the gaps and extend the grazing season is we're planting corn right now. Our corn may have gone in this week for this study. And then come about June 1st or first week of June, we're going to interseed cereal rye into that corn when the corn's about V4, V5 stage, about knee-high or so, before it gets too tall. But we can go in with an interseeder, which is more or less a no-till drill that's got every other row knocked out so it doesn't run over the corn. And then we let it grow through the summer. And then we harvest that corn as grain in late October, early November. We let that forage grow a little bit, that annual forage, and it will grow even in October and November. That cereal rye, once it gets the sun to it, the days are short, temperatures can be cold, but it can be warm as well. And we will get some growth to that. And then graze it, usually around mid-November into late November, early December. And then in the springtime, if we have time, which we did this year, we will graze it again in early spring. We went in early April and pulled the cows off a week ago Monday. And we still had forage, but we had to pull them off so we could get ready for corn season. So we have a randomized block design. We have 2 fields that are 3 replicated sites of grazed and non-grazed. In each location, we divided into 0.8 hectare paddocks. So we have 95 to 98 day relative maturity corn. We were using 102 or 105, moved back to 94, 95. We're actually getting 85-day corn this year to help us. You get some starter fertilizer and some more fertilizer whenever the cereal rye is interseeded. So we're harvesting that corn. We are taking forage biomass yields. Cereal rye is allowed to grow, as I mentioned. And then we're grazing it, taking quadrats, pre and post grazing, some pretty basic data. And we are grazing it with beef cows. And so we're frontal grazing them, which means we're giving them a new section every 2 to 3 days, depending on when they've cleaned up the forage. We're not back fencing them. One, because in the fall we don't have regrowth, and we have a water supply we need them to get to. And the animals at this point are only used as harvesters. We don't have animal data just because of the design. So in the spring grazing, we're grazing when it reaches about 20, 25 centimeters. We're still trying to find that sweet spot because the growth rates and when it starts can be really, really changeable from year to year. And the spring grazing does not happen every year because, one was COVID, but another is because of growth rates. We're grazing to 90% of biomass consumed, and then the non-grazed plots are mechanically harvested. They're sprayed down and replanted in corn. So we look at corn grain yields. I only have some preliminary data on this. But the 3 years, we had done it a couple years before as well. We didn't see any effect of grazing on the corn yields. We did have a lower corn yield in 2019, and this is because it was a very dry year. We had about close to 60% of the average rainfall, and particularly dry periods when the corn was establishing. So it really did hurt the corn yield. So we didn't do any grazing because the cereal rye was not sufficient for us to bring the cows in and graze. When we look at the pre and post corn grazing, corn stover, and cereal rye biomass yield, You can see that we had, very similar yields across the years. 2019 was a little bit lower because of that dry year. And then the post-graze, we did not do 2020 fall data because of COVID restrictions. We were not permitted to go out and do anything, so we weren't able. We got out and did the pre-graze, got our fingers slapped, and didn't do the post-graze. So you can see we got about 25, 26 days of grazing when we did graze in the fall. And if you convert this to total grazing days, and that was with 24 cows, that's 120 to 130 grazing days. So if you put the economics to that, which we will in the future, that could be a significant savings cost. Spring was a little bit different, 2019 and 2020. 2019 was that dry year into 2020, so we did not have grazing those years. We did graze in 2021, and what's interesting is if you look at the pre and the post grazing, what do you notice? The post graze is much higher in yield. We did not have enough cows. We needed more cows. We were restricted on the number of cows the farmer could provide us because of calving season and because of our ICUC restrictions, but we could have used double the cows. But we still got 21 days of grazing. Could have had a lot more or could have had a lot more cows. We were going to put this into a harvested forage because you could harvest the excess. So the lessons learned, we used annual ryegrass prior to this year, but it did not come up early enough for spring, so we'd switched to cereal rye. We used bred heifers, dairy heifers the first year that were used to grazing, but were not used to grazing corn stover, and that did not work out well. We've grazed too late. December was too late for us because we had an ice storm, and then we had water freezing as well. And the long season corn didn't work out for us. So the spring grazing was not as consistent as fall. We did get to do it this year, and hopefully it'll be more consistent for us in the future. You usually need a higher stocking density, rapid regrowth, and repeated corn. So just to give you a little bit on moving forward, we're going to determine when to add cattle and how many. And that's the challenge. If we just had the cows on the farm and could put and take, it would be easy. We're going to evaluate some different forage mixtures. We're going to start adding some annual legumes or brassicas to that. We're going to add some soil data collection, some of the parameters I was hearing today. We've got some expertise in our lab now that will really help us do that. For example, and then I'll stop there. So thank you. I know we're...
So we don't have time for questions, but Dr. Soder will be around. I also realized I was remiss. I did not formally introduce her. She is my former postdoc advisor, but that was Dr. Kathy Soder from USDA Agricultural Research Service in State College, Pennsylvania. So our next speaker, we're going to continue our more northernly tour, and we're going to move a little to the west. So our next speaker is Dr. Kim Casita. She is located at Michigan State University.
was looking for that. Okay. Turn that one off. No feedback. We don't like feedback. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to not stand in front of that light. I'm going to give a little bit of a change in focus here, and I'm not going to talk so much about the soil and the plant, although I love to talk about soil and plants. I'm going to talk about the animals. I've done research on cover crop grazing in many places across the country now with sheep, goats, and cattle. Mostly grazing brassicas. There's been a few other things mixed in there, but I am going to emphasize that. Because we have lots of people who have already told you why we want to do this and how, how it would benefit us. So I skipped right over that part because I'm late in the program. But I do want to point out that in most of the country we have three different, I'm going to switch hands here. We have three different times of the year or windows of opportunity for grazing cover crops. One is spring planting, when we can then use or I should say spring grazing with overwintered material that was planted the previous fall. So this would be primarily your small grains. You can have a short window of opportunity to graze those off in the spring, usually before your perennial forages are actually ready. And those can be planted after wheat the previous year or after corn silage. The next opportunity is summer grazing, and this is where you would have the spring planted cover crops. And typically where we see those used are are as part of a regular crop rotation. For example, in Michigan, we might use that where someone might be planting a cover crop after they terminated alfalfa the previous year because they're trying to alleviate autotoxicity before they come back in, plant more alfalfa, so they're just using something as a grazed cover crop in that window, or basically anytime you have an open field. And lastly, we see late fall or winter grazing with annuals that are usually planted after wheat. If you're in most parts of the country, the wheat comes off early enough that you can actually plant something else in there and get a significant window of opportunity. In Michigan, we've seen fall forage yield potential. That's usually where you have the most productivity due to the growing conditions, up to 9 to 11 megagrams per hectare, sometimes for these brassica mixtures. We're looking at a picture right there at the end of September in the lower part of Michigan. That's getting ready to have dairy cattle put out onto it. And I borrowed some numbers from one of my colleagues, Richard Earhart, who's a small ruminant specialist, looking at the cost of gain for lambs on feedlot versus some of these cover crops. So by his estimate, and this particular one was done in 2018, so of course prices change all the time. But he calculated that it was going to cost about $1.54 to put a pound or put a kilogram of gain on those lambs in a feedlot. On a perennial pasture, it was going to be between 44 cents and 51 cents. But when he was grazing brassica Sudan grass cover crop mixture, he was getting a cost of 81 to 91 cents, which is a lot less than the feedlot. It's a little bit more than the perennials because you do have to plant these things. All right, I'm going to talk about several trials that we've done. The first one is looking at cattle. This was a grass finishing trial with cattle on what was primarily a forage brassica mixture versus a more diverse mixture. And we were comparing this to perennial pasture. So in our perennial pasture was just sort of a standard, not particularly improved pasture that you'd see up in upper Michigan with a lot of things in it, grasses and legumes and a few forabs. Then we had a simple cover crop mix, which was turnip and oats. And then we had a complex mix, which was turnip and oats with a forage rape, a ryegrass, and a field pea. And these were drilled in June. This was considered to be part of a pasture renovation system. If you had a pasture you wanted to improve, this was a good way to get started with that. We did put 30 pounds of nitrogen on it all in July, and then we would graze it beginning usually in late August to November. For about 60 days was our target. We were trying to finish the steers on this, and they were going directly off these pastures to slaughter so that we could collect carcass data. So just to give you an idea of how much forage we had out here over the 3 years of the study, you can see that in the first year, our two cover crop mixes did a lot better than our perennial pasture. And that happened again in the third year. But in the middle year, the perennial pastures did a little bit better. This is due to rainfall and other growing conditions. All of these treatments were also being offered low-quality hay. For reasons that have been discussed, brassicas are often very low in fiber, so we wanted to make sure they had that opportunity, but they didn't eat very much of the hay. We also discovered with this that if you're in a grass-fed system, oats are not a very good choice, because it's sort of like what Dr. Soder just said. We didn't have enough cattle to keep up with those oats. When the oats started to head out and mature, the cattle couldn't eat them fast enough. So there was some grain out there. And if you're in a grass-fed system, this might not be the best plan if you have a market that's not going to accept that. In the second 2 years, we upgraded our hay to a higher quality to see if they'd eat it. They still wouldn't eat it because they liked the brassicas better. And we did not have a very high level of utilization. We're really only utilizing between 24 to 28% of the feed that we had out there, which is good if you're trying to maintain biomass out there, right? Nutritive composition about the across the different sampling dates. I just want to make a few points here. One is I want you to look at the dry matter, all right? Pretty low on these cover crops. And actually, it could be a lot lower than this for a brassica-based crop. This is something that people get concerned that the animals are not going to be able to eat enough dry matter because they're consuming too much water. We didn't really see any evidence that that was really happening, but that was one of the reasons we had the hay out there. The other thing I want to point out is the NDF column. I'm going to point the right place. We are aiming for a target here in our grass-fed beef systems. We want to maintain NDF less than 40%. Or 40, I wrote 48 on there. It should be 40. Because we're trying to maintain a high quality feed. All right, think dairy quality feed. We got to change the way we're thinking about this. You're trying to feed grass-fed animals. High quality forage in front of them all the time. And in fact, we did most of the time meet. We did meet the 48 target, and we're usually under the 47. All right. Oh, point this. All right, getting to the meat of this. A pun. Cattle performance. So the light blue here is the carcass adjusted average daily gain. That's adjusted for body size of the animals. And no difference between our perennial pasture and our cover crop pastures. All right? Surprise anybody? Surprise some of the people in Michigan were surprised. Final body weight, all right? The animals fed the mixture pasture, perennial pasture, were a little bit bigger than the ones that were on the cover crops. It was a significant difference, but it was not a large one. When we looked at dressing percentage, interestingly enough, the ones on the cover crops had a better dressing percentage than the ones on the perennials. All right? So probably less body fill because they're eating that really lush material with high digestibility. So if you're looking at just the sale weight of what you put on the truck to take to the sale barn, and you're getting paid on that, you'd be more concerned about this one. But if you're getting paid on carcass weight, which sometimes they are in a grass-fed system, you would be much more concerned about this weight down here. When we looked at gain per acre, both of our cover crop treatments had considerably better gain per acre than our perennial pasture. And this was in part because we had to give them more land area for the perennials than we had to for the cover crop. So the cover crop yields were better, it was growing faster, and so we were using less land to put this gain on them. All right, just a little bit about our carcass quality. Shear force values were measured, and there was actually remarkably little difference. And when we did this particular comparison, we also threw in some steaks that we bought at the supermarket just for comparative purposes. So that's what we have here for feedlot. Those are those supermarket steaks. And so those were more tender, all right? But if you look at all of our pasture-fed beef, including the perennial versus the cover crops, they all were within the acceptable range of tenderness. All right, so we were not producing tough meat here. All right, so the big thing that everyone always wants to know about is what it tastes like. So if you feed turnips to a cow, do you get turnip flavored beef? This concerns people. So we did a consumer panel. And these are the results of the consumer panel. Flavor, no difference. Texture and firmness, there was a little bit of a more preference there for the supermarket beef, but again, not a very big difference. It was quite variable for juiciness, and the overall acceptability of the simple pasture mix, that would be all brassica with oats, a little bit of oats, is the same as the feedlot. So we had no bad effect there. All right, moving on to a grazing cover crops with sheep. This is a very similar study. This one was it was very similar in how we conducted the animal part. We also have a subsequent crop component to this, which I hope some of you might have had a chance to see my graduate students' poster before they took them down, because he was telling people all about what happened when we grew the corn afterwards. But today, I'm just going to talk about the animals. So this system was planting cover crops after wheat, grazing it in the fall, terminating the surviving cover crops the following spring, planting silage corn, and going on in just a cycle. All right. Again, we were taking these lambs directly off pasture to slaughter so that we could get the carcass data. We had the treatments that we were using for the animal part of this were feedlot finished. We actually did feedlot finish the animals ourselves this time instead of going to the supermarket. We had a backgrounding treatment, which was 4 weeks on our brassica pasture and 4 weeks in the feedlot. We had a simple brassica only cover crop treatment, which was all brassica. It was turnips, rape, and radish mixed together. We had a complex cover crop mix. The idea here was partly we didn't want to feed these animals hay. We didn't want to have to do that transition, heavy transition, and worry about that low fiber. So if we have the fiber mixed in with the cover crop, then we're letting the animals select it themselves. That was the idea anyway. So that had a whole lot of things in it. So what did we get for available forage biomass? Pretty good. We were a little late planting these. Every year we did this due to weather and other complications. So these would get planted usually the first week of August. And so we're getting yield somewhere between just under 4 to up to 5 megagrams per hectare, which was more than enough to suit our purposes. We were strip grazing these animals across these fields. We did not see any difference in yield between our two cover crop treatments. And as you might expect, our yields did increase over the time period because this continues to grow throughout the fall. Our pasture nutritive composition, again, note this water content. This is lower than in the previous trial because we didn't have oats getting super mature. So one of the things we discovered with this, at least with growing sheep, is that they really didn't drink any water on this trial. So that's actually one of the plus things here. I mean, we had to diligently go haul the water out there because our animal welfare rules make us do it, but they never touched it. They were getting more than enough water from their feed. And also our NDF levels are right there in that range where we want to be. Here, I got the number right on here. All right, carcass data. And I threw the animal live weight on here too because it made better sense than making a whole nother chart. So I tried to group these by color. I'm not going to go through all these numbers one by one. I'm trying to show you a pattern here. So here we have our feedlot animals. Here's our background animals, which are half feedlot, half brassica. Here's our mixture, and here's our pure brassica. So when we had the numbers were more in the favorable range and it was a significant difference, it's in blue. If it is on the other end of the range and significant, it's bold black, and the gray numbers are intermediate. And I will point out that for all of these numbers, we had all of the animals in all the treatments were within the range of what our market is looking to buy. So we were not going to get discounted for any animals not being fat enough or anything. These were very close. And so basically the take-home point here is that we were able to finish lambs on cover crops and have a quite acceptable product. Okay? The animals finished on cover crops were a little smaller. They were within market range, but they were a little smaller. We did the consumer test again. And this time, much to our shock and amazement, actually, the preferred one was the ones grazing all brassica. Not only was there no bad flavor, they really liked that one. So no, you're not going to get a turnip flavor if you finish animals on a cover crop. All right, we also did a quick economic analysis here. Without going into a whole lot of detail, we basically found that there was not much difference between the feedlot and the all pasture treatments, but the ones that were backgrounded did really well in the economic picture because they didn't gain a whole lot in that first 4 weeks on pasture, but when we put them into the feedlot for the second 4 weeks, the compensatory gain went through the roof. And they ended up being just as big as the ones that were in the feedlot for the whole time period, with eating much cheaper feed. Now, I just want to finish up with talking about a few things that people always ask about on brassicas. It was mentioned earlier. Brassicas do accumulate nitrate. All right, you can look at the numbers that come out of these and they can be really scary. I did a trial many years ago where not only did we have some turnips hiding under this U, but we also had a lot of weeds that are also nitrate accumulators. We were really worried we were going to kill some sheep on this study. So we looked at the nitrate values. And we were indeed, if you looked at the nitrate in our feed, we were within the danger ranges for both the low weed pressure and the high weed pressure treatments. And it said that we should be limiting the feeding of these animals. But we didn't. We just held our breath and kept on going. And we actually did not find any negative effects on these animals that we could detect. We did go through and look at the lambing percentages. They were being bred while they were on this stuff, which is, you're not supposed to do that. And they all did fine. The thought here being that there's so much soluble sugar in brassicas that it is enabling the rumen to detoxify that nitrate as fast as it's coming in. All right. And to be honest, I haven't heard of any, I'm not sure I've ever heard of anyone losing animals to actual known nitrate toxicity on brassicas. Probably it's happened, but it's rare. Another thing people worry about a lot, and I think they probably shouldn't, is hemolytic anemia. This is sometimes called brassica poisoning. This is caused by an amino acid called S-methylcysteine sulfoxide, which can cause either a subacute or an acute hemolytic anemia, which may actually kill your animals. I know a lot of people in Europe and Australia, you deal with this. It actually happens. All right? It doesn't seem to happen much here for reasons that we are not completely clear on. But we actually did a study when I was working with ARS where we tried to induce this in goats with brassicas, and we were not able to get any detectable anemia in these animals when we were grazing them on brassicas. And I'd also looked for it in that previous study where we were looking at the nitrates. So I think people worry about this a lot more than they should. And a couple other things just to mention. Photosensitivity can happen in brassicas, but typically this is easy to prevent if you just don't graze it before 6 weeks after planting. It's an immature forage thing. Brassicas do contain goitrogens. This is a real thing, but just make sure you have iodine in your mineral mix and you pretty well solve that. We have had bloat on brassicas. This has been reported by a few other people as well. And all you can do about it is just be aware that it can happen and take your normal bloat precautions and just be careful. And with that, I probably used up more than enough time.
Thank you, Dr. Casita. So we've been learning some amazing stuff, but we also don't have time for questions for Dr. Casita. Our next talk I'm actually going to give, if you weren't here earlier, I am Leanne Dillard. I am the Forage Extension Specialist for Alabama. I am a faculty at Auburn University, and I'm going to try to sum up what my thoughts are based on this. I've been working, many of these people you've heard talk today, I work with on a regular basis, and so that's why I tried to put this talk together to try to give us some more information on how we can incorporate these systems in the eastern U.S. So Dr. Drewanowski said that she was an animal scientist talking about soil stuff. Well, I'm a forage agronomist that's going to talk about animal stuff. So as you can see, all of us kind of play that role as we go through of those different components because as has been mentioned, it's a system project. So there has to be a lot of different facets you look at. So cover crops as forages, just to kind of reiterate, this has already been said, but they, if you can't tell, they're very different. Even in the eastern U.S., we have very different growing systems. I was looking at Dr. Casita's slide where she had pearl millet and rye and brassicas all in one mixture, and my mind blown. So because I am about as far south as you can get from her, and we would never do that just because it's just to the point of it, they're very different systems. So we would typically want to look at multi-species, and for me it's cool season. Cool season would be, we take that with a grain of salt because for some things, summer annuals to me are also cool seasons, or can be in a mixture with cool seasons for other places. But things like we've already mentioned, the legumes, the small grains, and the brassicas. So I am an extension specialist, so when I look at these integrated crop livestock systems, I think about it from the producer standpoint, and there's always tons of questions. So for those of you who may not be from the U.S., this is where, the areas we've been focusing on over the last few talks. My projects I'm going to talk about are going to be down here very close to where Dr. Dubé was doing his work, actually about 30 minutes away. But as you saw, we've had North Carolina, Nebraska, which is somewhere up here, and Pennsylvania, Michigan as well. But I think across the board, we see our producers have a few questions that we have to answer, and some we've already talked about. Is it going to cause soil compaction to graze cover crops? Will the cattle cause other damage to the field? What will I still see the benefit of the cover crop? But I know I've talked to a lot of cover crop agronomists about this, because in their opinion, when you remove the biomass, you take away all of the benefit of the cover crop. So we need to answer that question. But also, lastly, is there an economic benefit? Because I think that was also mentioned earlier. Right now, there's a lot of incentives in the U.S. to do cover crops, and that's why they're being used. But as Dr. Dubé said, in the Southeast particularly, 5% of row crop producers use cover crops, and that's it. So we have a lot of room for improvement. So today I'm going to focus on 3 studies we have done in Alabama. I'm really lucky. I went to graduate school at Auburn, left, then came back. So over that time, I was actually involved in a set of cool season grazing studies that have been going on since, I'm not going to give you the date because we're not telling you how old I am, but for over 10 years, I've been involved in this series of studies at the station. Now, one thing I was talking with one of our extension agents earlier today is, what's funny is we've been doing work on grazing cool season annuals for a long time. We never called them cover crops. We didn't talk about integrated crop livestock systems, but we are grazing cool season annuals. But these are the same systems. Now, at the time, we weren't measuring the crop data or the soils data. We were focusing on the animal and the forage, which is what I'll talk about in a couple of these studies. But now we're integrating, looking at a more whole system. So just because those systems, the goal wasn't necessarily looking at the cover crops, that information is still valid, especially from the forage and from the animal perspective. So this first study is a study that was published in 2014 by one of my colleagues when we were graduate students, just looking at simple monocultures. So an annual ryegrass, which is not something we would typically use in the deep south for a cover crop because of its growth habit with when it overlays with our cash crops. But we were looking at that, triticale and wheat. And what we saw in this system, now we were using put and take animals, so that's a method of grazing where we're trying to keep forage allowance pretty steady to take into account any differences in forage yield. So really any differences you see in animal performance should be the effect of, or excuse me, any differences in individual animal gains should be the effect of forage quality. And then we overlay that with our stocking densities to calculate gain per hectare in order to look at how the yield takes effect of that. So when we were looking at this, there wasn't a lot of difference in forage mass. Again, we were trying to keep that steady by using those put and take animals. This is a steer system, so we were looking at yearling stockers, beef cattle. Forage allowance, again, we were working to keep that steady so we don't expect to see differences. What we did see differences is these grazing days per hectare and stocking density, which obviously are related. So what we saw was in this system, we were able to get better grazing days per hectare in our wheat system than we were our annual ryegrass and triticale. Wheat does have a little bit of a longer growing season. I will say this triticale was, obviously this study was published over 10 years ago, so these were some older varieties of triticale when it first was getting popular, so that data would change a little bit now. Stocking density also was affected, so we had our highest stocking density with our wheat, with our ryegrass and our triticale being similar. Now, what we did with that was when we were looking at these school season annuals, we wanted then to look at them in combination. So what does it look like when we truly put these together? Dr. Harmon talked about extending our grazing season by making mixtures. So what happens when we put those together? So what we have here in this first column is a wheat, triticale, and annual ryegrass system. And then we have wheat and ryegrass alone and triticale and ryegrass. So what we saw is when we put a small grain with our annual ryegrass, we saw no differences. So across any of our parameters, be it forage mass and forage allowance, which again, we were working with our put and take animals to keep steady so we don't expect any differences, but also with our grazing days per hectare as well as our stocking rate. So it didn't really matter which small grain you used, but it was beneficial to add that small grain to your annual ryegrass. Now, this last study, which we just finished, a 4-year study looking at intentionally grazing cover crops at this same station. Now, this is the coastal plain of Alabama, so it is a sandy type soil, kind of a sandy loam. Not as quite as sandy as where Dr. Dubé is, which is a little bit further south, but it is a sandy type soil in the coastal plain of Alabama. So in this study, we were using the same mixture. So we were using oats, cereal rye, which is a pretty much standard cover crop variety in the deep south because it grows a lot of biomass, crimson clover as a legume, and then using a T-Raptor brassica, which is a turnip rape hybrid. But we were looking at, can we see the benefit of the cover crop with different grazing lengths? Because when we're talking about cover crops, at least in the deep south, but I would say Dr. Soder talked about this as well, length of the grazing season is really where we're going to be seeing that. Can we get the animals on there long enough to see an economic benefit? So in this study, we did no grazing, this first set of numbers, 45 days, 75 days, or 105 days of those animals being on the field, and those were our treatments. Now, this is looking at botanical composition of those mixtures. We did put the grasses together because what we found was, one, it's a little hard to tell oat from cereal rye at different stages, but two, based on their growth habits, they kind of played out. So we just put the grasses together because we were looking at it from a functional group standpoint. So the majority of our system was in grasses, which was what we expected. So about 70-75% grass in our component with similar compositions depending on our treatments. They didn't really change. So we had about 8 to 10% brassica, and then we had about 10 to 15% clover, which when we seeded it was what we were expecting. Now, one thing I didn't mention in all these systems, since we did cover a lot of different places today, is that we're planting following a cotton peanut rotation. So typically we're planting about the first week of November, and then we're putting cattle on the first week of January, and then grazing through either these days. Usually we're talking about the first week of May in some of these situations in this last study a little bit earlier, but so that we can, because we'll be planting our cotton peanuts right now. Actually, it's a little delayed this year because of the cold, but right now typically we would have our cotton and peanuts in the ground. A little bit different than the traditional corn soybean system. So in this study, looking at the same parameters, in this case we also used put and take, so we were looking at our forage allowance, keeping it the same, but we did look at different grazing lengths, which did change our forage biomass. Also, we did have our no grazing component. So we did see that, as you would expect, no grazing has a higher biomass than grazing. I mean, there's no surprise there, right, over the course of the season. Now, when we looked at our grazing treatments, we saw no difference in our forage allowance. Among our 3 treatments, our grazing days per hectare, which was surprising, because you would think the longer you graze in the season, you should have more grazing days per hectare. But in this trick, the system is because of the cereal rye. So where we were using a Florida-developed variety of cereal rye. It had seed heads on it the second week of January. So Dr. Soder was talking about we didn't have enough animals. Dr. Casita talked about, we didn't have enough animals either. That's what we've seen. These systems explode and produce a ton of biomass in a very short period of time. And then especially with the cereal rye, it played out really fast. So in our later dates, we actually found in several years, depending on the weather, we had to remove animals early or pause the study and put animals back, which on the average over the 3 years of the study did show that affected our forage allowance. Okay, well, obviously the computer doesn't want me to talk. So we're just gonna open this back up, see if I can use the Mac. And I'm not a Mac person, so. And I can talk y'all through that. I'm an extension specialist. If we don't have it up in 30 seconds, I'll just keep talking. It's one thing you can guarantee. Extension specialists will not be short on words. Well, all right. Well, I'm just going to keep talking. So, on looking at this, and I'm actually going to grab my phone because I have my slides on my phone so I can remember what I'm going to talk about so that they are not here for 3 hours. So on Russell's study, which was the study we used on the cover crops, like I was saying, what we had was that in the system, we did see inconsistent forage production because of the cereal rye. We're actually just got a SARE grant with Dr. Dubé at Florida to do another year of that, or another 3 years of that study, and I actually took the rye out. And I always find it funny, for those of you who are in the U.S., specifically the eastern side, you know we got super cold in December. And that's all my fault, because what I said was, I'm tired of this rye. It's not in our system. It doesn't do well. Awesome. We have a tech guru that's gotten my slides back up, so y'all don't have to hear me ramble. Oh, now we have a blue screen, but, oh, there we go. Yes. So, awesome. This is why we have the students who understand the technology work with in conjunction with the old people that don't understand Macs. So, when we looked at this system, and this is where I was, we can see that we did not see any difference in grazing days per hectare or stocking density, and that had to do specifically with that mixture we used. So we're still fine-tuning that mixture, and that's something I think you've heard as a theme, is that there's so many different ways you can manipulate these systems, it becomes a factor of trying to fine-tune it. So this is a table that's looking at the forage quality of all these 3 different studies, and I just included this to kind of give an idea. I think most of y'all know cool season annuals are amazing. They're really high quality. I'm talking about a beef system here, and even with steers, all of these were easily meeting the nutrient required to those animals. We're not finishing animals like Dr. Casita, so they have a little bit of a higher level nutrition they need, like that dairy level. I like that dairy level nutrition. We're just we're backgrounding here and trying to put some, usually we're shooting for about 1.5 kilograms average daily gain per animal per day over the course of the season. So we were able to see quite a good forage quality. The only difference we really saw was in that first study where we were looking at the different the different monocultures. We did see some difference where ryegrass is a little higher quality in their small grains, but in general, very good in terms of quality for our goals. So now looking at the animal data, we have seen this looking back at the Mullenix study that was published in 2014. We see that we were getting that 1.5-ish, maybe 1.3 to 1.5 kilograms of average daily gain per day. Now, I always talk with my producers in Alabama, I think in the Southeast, or beef producers in general, they get stuck on the average daily gain. But when it gets down to it, it's really gain per hectare that's where they get their money, right? Number one limiting resource, I think, across the world is going to be land. So I can have one animal do really well, or 2 animals do kind of well. Kind of well adds up twice more than really well does once. So I really try to push that gain per hectare. But this study was published back when I was a student, and I did what my professor asked me to do, so we didn't calculate that total gain per hectare. I do have that information, I think, from way back when, so hopefully one day I can calculate that to be able to compare it. But in the more recent study where we looked at the mixtures of the small grains and annual ryegrass, we did calculate that gain per hectare, and it was not different. Again, the same story where if we're going to do the system, the small grains are very similar. We can just add them to our system, at least in this case where we're looking at wheat and triticale. Now, if we use cereal rye, I do think we would have seen quite a bit of difference. So in this last study that we were just working on with my PhD student, we were looking at the different grazing days. What we saw was we were getting a little bit less, 1.3 kilograms per day of average daily gain on these steers. So these come in at about 6 weights. So that's going to be about 300 kilograms. I'm sorry, rough American conversion, I apologize. They're 600 pounds when they come in, so about 300 kilograms. And then we're trying to put 200 to 300 pounds on them, get them off at 8 weights, and that's where they would go in the backgrounding phase and get ready to go to the feedlot in the U.S. system, at least how it works in the eastern U.S. So we were looking at that, and we didn't really see any difference. Again, we had a lot of variability between years on the amount of time we were able to graze, and so you can see that total gain per hectare ended up not being different, even though those animals were on the study longer. So one thing we did do, my PhD student added this, wasn't one of the original goals, but one thing he wanted to look at was methane production. That is an important part of looking at these systems and the overall ecosystem services. So he did an in vitro study on the last mixture, looking at how the maturity changes and affects VFA, or volatile fatty acid production, as well as methane production across the season. Now, this was in vitro. We haven't quite got to the point where we're going to be doing this in the animal. We're hoping to do that with Dr. Dubé because he's set up to do that. But we did do it in vitro. So what we did is we took those mixtures from the no graze study. We collected samples it was the middle one. So it was the 75 days of grazing, the January, February, March, and April, to look at how the plants mature. Mind you, I talked about the cereal rye being very mature throughout the system, and if that affected methane production. So what he saw in this was that total VFAs really didn't change throughout the course of the season. The amount of energy those animals were able to get stayed very similar. But what did change was the acetate to propionate ratio. And if you're not ruminant nutritionists, just to give you a quick rundown of that, that is the good stuff. What the acetate to propionate ratio is really what's showing what is going to give us extra hydrogen in the system. And extra hydrogen leads to methane, because that's how the rumen gets rid of that inefficient system. So as we do that and we saw that shift in acetate to propionate ratio, we saw a major change in methane production. And no surprise, as the forages became more mature throughout the season, we ended up with more methane production from January through April. So this tells me, in some cases, and maybe, again, going to some of these other studies, it might be a situation where we need to put a lot of animals heavy on it for a very short period of time and flash graze it, be able to get some gains on there, and then let it regrow for biomass. So just to leave you with a last couple of things, we did look at cash crop performance. I mentioned this was a cotton peanut system. I don't have all the data. This is preliminary. So we had 2 years of cotton and 2 years of peanut. But from this in 2020, this is just representing 1 year of cotton. We did see that the no grazing and the 45 days of grazing did not affect our cotton lint yield, where we did see a slight reduction in cotton lint yield in the 75 and 105 days. So we did want to try to figure out what that was. So we also were looking at soil compaction. So we measure soil compaction using and I'm not a soil scientist, I will be the first to admit that, a machine that looks at both in row as well as between row soil compaction. It has a penetrometer attached to a tractor, and you go through the field. So it's measuring down to 50 centimeters in the soil. Right in the middle of each of these graphs is going to be your cash crop row. So this is where the cotton would be planted. And then you're going to be looking at soil compaction within 45 centimeters total, so 22 centimeters on each side. Now this is our no grazing, and we saw this is what you would see if you planted the cover crops and did nothing. Now I will say, while we no-tilled everything, we did use a subsurface roller after a chemical burn down to terminate our cash crops because of the soil type we were using. That's kind of standard in that system. It's not a complete no-till, it's a minimal till system. And so with 45 days, while it was not significantly different, we did see possibly the addition of some amount of cover crop. And I think that might be because that's one of our rainiest times. So those animals were there during that period of time and they were taken off, where we did not see that as much on our 75 and 105 days. And I think that might be kind of like Dr. Dranowski, I believe, was talking about kind of tilling with the animals, right, when you're doing corn grazing. So this is very mucky, even in those sandy soils. We get the animals off and it kind of crusts over, where later in the year, maybe, and this is me just postulating here, I have no idea, those animals maybe do a little bit more breaking up that crust, and so we're seeing less compaction that goes later. Now, obviously, these are the deep soil layers, so I'm not sure if that's just me postulating, but we did see some interesting patterns on this system. We're continuing the study to really see what the long-term effects are, because it's very interesting data. So the last thing I will leave you with real quick is just some economic considerations, because we don't have them. We're hoping to do those soon, but this is from a study in the Midwest, and I think it's already pretty much been said that a lot of us in Extension promote cover crops, especially grazing cover crops, as economically beneficial. You put those animals on there, then you're able to get the animal weight off. But what we found is it's super inconsistent, and you don't always get animal returns. The good thing is very rarely do you lose money with this system. You usually just break even. So in this system, which was from the Midwest, so not necessarily applicable to the Southeast, we saw that with cash crops, you were able to get higher revenue in either a 2-year or a 4-year integrated crop livestock system by including animals. Your costs were higher, so at the end, there was no difference. So unfortunately, there wasn't an economic incentive for adding those cattle, but there was also not a detriment. So with that, we also can say that forage performance and forage quality are sufficient to provide animals. We can put animals on there. We still need more data in order to determine how that system works, especially in the Southeast in a cotton peanut rotation, which is our version of a cotton soybean. When we look at, there's at least 75 days of grazing we can get in that system without harming the soil, but we need to look at further impacts. I think that's another been theme of the day is we need long-term research. We know I can't look at soil compaction over 4 years and really tell you how that's going to work. And then previous research has shown that the economic viability is back and forth. So unfortunately, from my perspective, I can't sell it as being a benefit, but this is something we need to look at more, because maybe under long term we can get rid of that variability and maybe see an economic benefit. The last thing I will say is, if you haven't heard already, I think the booth is up, but if you haven't gotten the Forage Lagoon books, they're going fast. That was a collaboration between some of the people you've heard from today for the Southeast. It's a very good producer-friendly book for forage legumes that we had at the booth. I have plenty of copies if you want one and haven't gotten one yet. And with that, I am over, but you're more than welcome to hang around and ask questions. Several of our speakers are still here that are willing to take questions as well. Thank you very much.